The barn was alive with music, lanterns swung from wooden beams, laughter rippled through the warm Texas air, and the scent of smoked brisket hung heavy as dusk deepened into orange. A group of Japanese prisoners, still in khaki uniforms but with borrowed clean shirts, stood frozen at the gate. They had been told they'd work the ranch that week, mend fences, clear brush, fix the old well. But instead, a cowboy with a sunburned smile and a Stetson hat had said something none of them could believe. "Your guests today." Before they could react, a young bride in lace walked toward them, her white dress shimmering in the lantern light. Her father, the same man who guarded them, tipped his hat and motioned them in. Music swelled. Someone handed them plates piled with barbecue. One prisoner trembled, clutching the food as if it were a trick. But it wasn't. They had been invited to an American wedding. The prisoners stood at the threshold of something they could not name. The evening air shimmered with heat, and the smell of mesquite smoke drifted from the barbecue pit, where cowboys in rolled-up sleeves turned slabs of beef over glowing coals. Lanterns hung from the rafters of the old barn like captured stars, their soft yellow light falling on women in gingham dresses, men in dusty boots, and tables lined with pies and mason jars. Fiddles sang near the porch, their notes rising and falling like laughter carried on the wind. To the Japanese soldiers, it looked less like a camp and more like a dream stitched together from impossibilities. They had crossed oceans expecting chains, humiliation, and silence. Instead, they found music and warmth, and the sound of someone calling them guests. One of the men, a former naval mechanic from Yokosuka, clenched his fists as he stared at the crowd. The wedding guests moved freely, faces open and unguarded. He could not remember the last time he had seen faces like that. Not in the barracks, not even at home before the bombings began. Everything in his training screamed that this was a trick, a test meant to expose weakness. His hands trembled, not from fear of violence, but from the unbearable strangeness of being treated kindly. The ranch stretched wide under the Texan dusk, fields running gold toward the horizon, fences glinting like wire spun from sunlight. Children darted between tables, chasing one another through the dust, their laughter mingling with the fiddle's tune. Beside the barn, the bride and groom swayed in their first dance, the hem of her white dress sweeping the floor, the cowboy's boots scuffing the boards. The prisoners could only stare. They had seen victory parades, funerals, and forced marches, but never something so human, so achingly ordinary. They whispered among themselves in low voices, uncertain whether they should remain at the edge or retreat toward the barracks. "This cannot be real," one murmured. Another shook his head, eyes fixed on the firelight. "It is a test. They want to laugh at us." The thought hung in the air, half believed, half hoped against. The guards, no, the cowboys, watched them without malice, their postures relaxed, rifles slung casually like tools. The same man who had spoken the invitation stepped forward now, hat tilted, boots crunching softly on gravel. He was tall, sunburned, his face carved by years of wind and work. When he spoke, his voice carried the rhythm of the plains. "Your guests today," he said again, as if the words themselves could bridge oceans. "Eat, celebrate, the war's over here." The words struck harder than any blow. Guests. The sound of it made something twist inside their chests. One by one, they were handed plates. Real ceramic, not tin mess trays. The aroma that rose from them was overwhelming, smoked beef glistening with fat, cornbread still steaming, beans thick with molasses. Some hesitated, unsure if it was safe to eat, but others could not resist. The first bite was a quiet rebellion against everything they had been told. A man who had once sworn to die for the Emperor now stood beneath American lanterns, tasting food prepared by the enemy. He closed his eyes, and for the briefest moment, shame and hunger blurred into something dangerously close to peace. Around them, the celebration carried on. The bride passed near the group, her smile hesitant but not forced, her veil fluttering in the warm breeze. A small girl tugged at a prisoner's sleeve and offered him a flower, her curiosity unspoiled by the language dividing them. He took it carefully, holding it as though it might vanish. Laughter broke out near the bonfire, and in that sound the prisoners heard no cruelty, only life continuing without them. The night deepened. Stars crowded the sky, mirrored in the polished tin of the musicians' instruments. The prisoners lingered on the edge of light, unsure whether to step closer or retreat into the dark. The cowboy saw their hesitation and walked toward them again, motioning with an easy gesture. "Come on now," he said softly. "Ain't no work tonight." Something in his tone, calm, unhurried, made obedience unnecessary. They followed, crossing the invisible line between captor and captive, between fear and wonder. As they stepped into the barn's golden glow, the air thick with smoke and song, the band struck a faster tune, boots stomping in time. For the first time since leaving their homeland, the Japanese soldiers felt the weight of war loosen slightly from their shoulders. One of them looked up, eyes reflecting the lantern light, and whispered, "So this is what it means to live." And beneath the music, the cowboy's words lingered, soft as prayer. "Your guests today?" The words echoed long after the music faded, long after the laughter and fiddles had melted into the Texas night. But years earlier, on another shore, there had been no warmth, no lantern light, no invitation, only surrender. The same men who now stood under the glow of a ranch wedding had once crouched behind shattered palms on an island where even the sea smelled of gunpowder. They had been taught since childhood that to live through defeat was the ultimate disgrace, that a captured soldier carried eternal shame. When the white flags went up and their officers turned pistols on themselves, the air felt heavier than death. Those who lived did not feel alive. They felt hollowed out, stripped of purpose, their faces like cracked porcelain masks. The war had ended for them, not with honor, but with humiliation, and they believed their families would rather think them dead. They were herded together, weak and burned by sun, the salt of sweat mixing with tears they dared not shed. Some whispered prayers to ancestors, others cursed the gods for letting them survive. In that moment, captivity was worse than execution. Yet the Americans who captured them did not raise their rifles in triumph. They moved among the prisoners with calm efficiency, offering canteens of water and cigarettes that few dared to touch. For men raised on stories of enemy barbarism, such gestures were terrifying in their gentleness. They waited for the cruelty to come, but it never did. The journey that began on that blistered shore would carry them farther from home than they could imagine, across an ocean and into the heart of a land they had been told was savage. The voyage was long and silent. The holds of the transport ship were cramped, smelling of salt and rust, the air thick with sickness and sweat. Days blended into nights, measured only by the sound of waves and the creak of metal. Food came twice a day, ladled into bowls. Real food, though their stomachs, shrunken from months of hunger, could barely hold it. Some men ate in silence, others stared at the floor, unable to reconcile nourishment with captivity. When storms hit, the ship rolled so violently that buckets spilled and prayers were whispered in every tongue. They were allowed on deck at times, where the horizon stretched empty and blue, mocking them with its endless distance. One man carved small kanji into the railing with his fingernails, his daughter's name, his last memory of home. Yet slowly, disbelief began to soften into weary curiosity. The Americans guarding them spoke rarely, but when they did, it was without hatred. One young sailor handed a prisoner a blanket on a cold night, nodding as if the act required no explanation. That simple gesture haunted the man for years. He could not understand a world where mercy was given freely. When land appeared again, it was not the Asia they longed for, but a coastline so vast and green it looked like a mirage. Texas. The trains that carried them inland clattered through a countryside that seemed untouched by war. There were no bombed cities, no starving children scavenging in ruins, only open fields and the faint shimmer of distant cattle herds. The prisoners sat pressed against the windows, watching America roll by, pecan trees, red barns, white fences, and skies so wide they made a man feel small. They expected the camps to be harsh, but when the doors opened, there were no bayonets waiting, no snarling dogs. Instead, men in broad hats and sun-faded shirts greeted them with cautious nods. Cowboys, not soldiers. The camps were ringed with barbed wire, but beyond the fences stretched pastures instead of battlefields. Inside were barracks built of clean wood, kitchens that smelled faintly of bread, and fields of wheat shimmering in the wind. The guards carried rifles slung loosely, as though formality required them, but necessity did not. When the prisoners were assigned to work, they were handed tools instead of shackles. They tilled soil, repaired fences, and mended roofs beneath skies that refused to look like captivity. At night, they lay on bunks, staring at the stars beyond the wire, wondering if their families could see the same constellations half a world away. Shame still burned in them, but so did confusion. They had been told America was cruel, godless, without honor. Yet here, on ranches where the wind carried the scent of hay instead of smoke, they were treated like men who still had worth. The long road from the Pacific had not ended in chains. It had led them to a place where even enemies could show decency. And though they could not yet understand it, this quiet contradiction was the beginning of their unmaking. Still, the memory of what they had been told clung to them like damp cloth. Every Japanese soldier carried inside him the stories drilled from childhood, the vision of the American as a beast without honor. In dusty classrooms, officers spoke of enemy cruelty with rehearsed conviction, that captured soldiers were flayed, starved, mocked until they begged for death. Posters and pamphlets showed crude drawings of grinning devils in uniform. Even radio broadcasts had hissed the same warning: surrender and your body will be desecrated, your name erased. To die for the emperor was duty. To live in the enemy's hands was unthinkable. When the first rumors spread that the Americans had built camps instead of execution grounds, no one believed them. They thought mercy was a lie invented to lure fools into disgrace. Bushido, the ancient code of the warrior, was their law. It was carved into them through training, through shame, through repetition. Death was purity. Life after defeat was pollution. Many had seen officers pull grenades against their own hearts rather than face capture. Even those who lacked courage envied them, for they believed death preserved the soul. So, when these men found themselves behind barbed wire instead of in graves, something in them shattered. Each sunrise over the Texan fields was a reminder of dishonor. They bowed stiffly to guards, expecting mockery, but received only nods. Cowboys walked past them with calm indifference, boots dusted with red clay, rifles slung like tools. The absence of cruelty unnerved them more than cruelty could have. At night, in the barracks, they whispered their confusion. "Why are we alive?" one asked. "What do they want?" The silence afterward was heavier than the question. In their hearts, they still braced for punishment. Yet, when the first work orders came, they were told to help mend fences, to haul hay, to paint barns. The men they worked beside did not sneer or spit. They spoke with patient gestures, showing how to tie rope, how to drive nails straight. A cowboy once placed a canteen in a prisoner's hands and said, "Hot day." That was all. But the tone, plain, unguarded, disarmed the man completely. He had been ready for hatred. Instead, he found courtesy. The small acts accumulated until the old armor began to crack. The prisoners had imagined whips, but were handed gloves. They expected insults, but were met with silence or humor. Even the food felt like contradiction. Fresh bread, beans, and coffee that tasted of warmth instead of ashes. One soldier wrote later, "They shame us not by cruelty, but by kindness." The humiliation was deeper than any wound. At the wedding, that shame reached its peak. The cowboys called them guests, not prisoners. Music filled the air, and women in white dresses offered them food. It was absurd, impossible. Every story they had ever heard about America burned away under the glow of lanterns and laughter. One prisoner could not stop staring at the bride's veil. It fluttered like the flag of a country he no longer understood. Another man bit into a piece of cornbread and wept silently, unable to explain the taste of forgiveness. That night, the men sat awake long after the last fiddle song ended, staring through the barn slats at the moon. Their code had promised death as purity, but they had found dignity instead. And that, they realized, was far harder to bear. Now that dignity was being served on a plate. The tables outside the barn groaned under the weight of food, and the prisoners could scarcely believe it was for them. The scent alone was overwhelming. Smoked beef, cornbread baked golden at the edges, beans thick and sweet, coffee so strong it carried through the air like a promise. The heat from the pit rolled across the yard, carrying the hiss of fat dripping into fire. A cowboy in an apron sliced brisket with a steady hand, the blade flashing beneath the lanterns. The Japanese men stood in a hesitant line, shoulders tense, eyes darting as if waiting for a trick. But none came. When their turn arrived, they were served the same portions as everyone else. No separate bowls, no insults, just food, steaming and real, placed in their hands with the same words spoken to every guest: "Eat." The first bites came slowly, almost fearfully. The flavor hit like a shock. Meat that melted on the tongue, smoky and rich. Bread that crumbled soft as clouds. It had been months, some years, since such nourishment. One man's jaw quivered as he chewed, the muscles unused to tenderness. Another lowered his head in silence, ashamed at the tears that came unbidden. They had been trained to scorn comfort, to treat pleasure as weakness. Yet here they were, trembling before a plate of food. Around them, laughter rose and fell like a tide. The Americans ate noisily, without ceremony, tearing bread with their hands, drinking from tin cups, clinking spoons against bowls. The casual abundance was almost obscene. For the prisoners, each bite was both relief and accusation. Why had the enemy learned mercy while their own leaders had starved them? Music poured from the barn, the kind that had rhythm instead of command. Fiddles sang, boots struck the wooden floor in time, and the sound spilled through the open doors like sunlight. To men accustomed to military chants and drums, this was another kind of language, one that spoke not of victory, but of joy. It felt dangerous, even seductive. Some of the younger prisoners tapped their fingers unconsciously, caught by the rhythm. Others sat still, trying to harden themselves against it. But the music kept breaking through, stubborn as hope. One cowboy spun a laughing girl in circles near the firelight, her skirt flaring as she twirled. The image was too much for one soldier, a former schoolteacher from Nagasaki. He stared at the dance, his face rigid, until suddenly he began to laugh, softly at first, then helplessly. His comrades turned in alarm, mistaking it for madness. But it wasn't madness. It was release. The sound startled even him, as if it had come from a part of his soul that had forgotten how to speak. The contradictions deepened with every passing moment. Prisoners and guards shared air, shared sound, even shared silence. The women serving food smiled politely, not mockingly. One offered a refilled cup, and when the man she served bowed awkwardly, she returned the gesture with equal grace. The gesture, simple and human, struck like lightning through his shame. A cowboy leaned on a post, watching the scene unfold. "Guess war's over for tonight," he said to no one in particular. And perhaps, for that one evening, it was. As the night wore on, the last of the light drained from the sky, leaving the stars to burn cold and clear. The music slowed, the laughter softened. Children began to yawn and tug at their mothers' skirts. Near the edge of the yard, a small boy with freckles noticed one of the Japanese prisoners sitting apart, his plate untouched. The boy hesitated, then trotted over, clutching something in his hand, a cookie wrapped in wax paper. Without a word, he held it out. The prisoner blinked, unsure how to respond. He had seen American soldiers hand out rations before, but this was different. This was a gift, small and uncalculated. Slowly, he reached out and took it. The boy smiled, shy but certain, then ran back toward the light. The man stared at the cookie for a long moment before breaking it in half. He tasted it, sweet, soft, absurdly innocent, and felt something inside him unravel. The flavor was foreign, but it carried warmth he recognized from another life. His mother baking rice cakes before the air raids, the smell of sugar, the sound of her voice. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he was not a soldier or a captive. He was simply human. Around him, the music began again, the fiddles softer now, the rhythm steady as a heartbeat. And in that fragile silence between notes, the prisoners of war felt the first stirrings of peace, unspoken, uneasy, but real. When dawn rose over the ranch, the fields shimmered with dew and smoke drifted from the dying wedding fire. The prisoners moved quietly, unsure if what they had experienced had truly happened. The word guest still echoed in their minds like a bell they couldn't unhear. It clashed against everything they'd been taught. Guests, not captives, fed, not punished. It was a kindness so simple it unsettled them. Later, as they helped clear the barn, one of the cowboys approached. He was tall and rangy, his shirt sleeves rolled, his eyes creased from sun and years. "You fellas did good last night," he said easily, sweeping his hat from his head. "Reckon folks'll be talking about them polite Japanese guests for a while." The prisoners exchanged wary looks. One, braver than the rest, asked in hesitant English, "Why you? Let us eat?" The cowboy paused, considering. "Well," he said slowly, "a man don't turn down food at a wedding. You feed every guest who steps on your land, friend or stranger, even an enemy, just for that night. He's not one." He nodded once, satisfied that no more needed saying, and walked away. The words sank deep. Feed every guest. For men raised under Bushido, the way of death and loyalty, the idea was both alien and familiar. Bushido demanded honor through sacrifice. Mercy was weakness. Yet this cowboy's code carried its own kind of honor, older and quieter. It didn't shout of conquest or purity. It lived in fairness, in small decencies that required no witness. For the first time, the prisoners saw that honor could exist without cruelty. They began to notice the pattern. The cowboys shared water before drinking themselves. They paused their work to help a man tangled in wire. They treated labor as partnership, not punishment. No one gloated over their power. The rhythm of work, hammering, hauling, breathing under the same sun, became a language between them. A strange equality grew there, unspoken but steady. At first, the prisoners resisted it. Fairness without hierarchy felt impossible, even dangerous. But the Americans' ease was disarming. They did not need to prove strength. It was assumed in how they carried themselves. When one cowboy laughed and said, "A man's worth is how he treats the folks who can't pay him back," the prisoners went silent. The words were plain, but they carried weight. It was Bushido reshaped by mercy, stripped of vanity. At night, the men lay awake under the scent of hay and sweat, remembering that simple code: feed every guest. Work fair, treat others right, even when the world says not to. The idea worked on them like water wearing down stone. What if honor was not lost in surrender? What if it was found in how one lived after defeat? In time, the barbed wire around the camp seemed less menacing. It still marked boundaries, but something had shifted inside them. The cowboys had given them no sermons, no forgiveness, only decency. And in that quiet, the prisoners saw a strength they had never known, the strength to look upon an enemy and still choose kindness. For men raised to worship death, it was the most humbling kind of victory. Days passed after the wedding, but the memory of it clung to the prisoners like the scent of smoke in their clothes. The music, the laughter, the taste of sweet cornbread, all lingered longer than they wished to admit. It had not been a dream. They had danced on the edges of their enemy's joy and been welcomed instead of despised. When word came that they would be allowed to write letters home, a silence fell through the barracks. For months, their only voice had been memory. Now, at last, they were being asked to speak. But what could they possibly say? They gathered around the tables in the mess hall, blank paper before them, pencils stubbed to dull points. The guards handed out envelopes, nodding politely, as if this were any other duty. The men stared down at the pages, uncertain where to begin. One soldier from Kagoshima, once proud to call himself a son of the emperor, chewed the end of his pencil and whispered, "What can I tell them? That the Americans fed us? That they smiled?" He shook his head, afraid even the thought might be treason. Around him, others wrestled with the same invisible weight. To speak truthfully might brand them as collaborators. To lie would make them cowards. And so the first lines came haltingly, careful, shaped like riddles. "We are treated according to rules. The enemy behaves strangely human." Every sentence became an act of diplomacy between two worlds, the old Japan of honor and the new one that existed behind barbed wire. They described the work, the food, the civility, but the real story hid between the lines. How could they explain the cowboys' code, the laughter at the wedding? The sight of American children running barefoot through dust while they, the defeated, were given clean clothes and soap? Some tried to soften it with formal phrasing. The captors fulfilled the regulations of the Geneva Convention with precision. Others dared to slip through fragments of truth. We were guests at a celebration. It was very strange, yet peaceful. Weeks later, Those letters crossed oceans, sealed in canvas mailbags, arriving in a Tokyo still trembling from air raids. The censors opened them first. Their job was to strip the words of poison, anything that might weaken the spirit of the homeland. But these letters baffled them. There were no pleas for rescue, no hatred for the enemy. Only quiet astonishment. We are well fed. We labor with fairness. They are not as we were told. One censor, a weary man who had lost his son in the war, read and reread a line that made no sense to him. They invited us to a wedding. He set the letter down, staring at the ink as if it might move. What did it mean? That the enemy had shown kindness. The words did not fit the world he knew. A few letters slipped through to families untouched by the censor's pen. Mothers and wives, trembling as they unfolded the pages, wept not from fear, but from confusion. Their sons were alive, healthy, even grateful. In towns reduced to rubble, these letters sounded like rumors of another universe. A woman from Osaka clutched a letter to her chest and whispered, "My son is safe, because the enemy gave him bread?" For years she had cursed America's bombs. Now she didn't know whom to hate. Back in Texas, the prisoners continued to write. Some wrote every week, describing work in the fields, the changing light on the prairie, the sound of trains passing at dusk. The more they wrote, the more their tone changed. The bitterness faded, replaced by reflection. It was as if each word freed them a little from the weight of propaganda. Their hands, once trained to obey lies, began to tell truths instead. Not political truths, but human ones. The taste of food after hunger, the warmth of decency, the realization that survival could be honorable. And though the world outside the wire could not yet hear it, those words were beginning to ripple outward, quiet as wind across tall grass. They would travel farther than any soldier ever could, carried not by guns or flags, but by ink. A strange army of letters marching home to a country still blinded by pride, whispering a single, forbidden revelation: the enemy has a heart. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and utterly changed. The wedding had ended, the letters had been sent, yet something unseen had shifted in the air. The prisoners rose at dawn, as always, boots crunching over the dry earth. But the silence between them and the cowboys was no longer heavy with suspicion. It was a silence of concentration, of shared work. The old fear had not vanished, it never would, but it had been replaced by a quiet understanding that neither side could fully explain. The morning sun was already hot when they were taken to the far pasture to repair a stretch of broken fence. The cowboys carried coils of wire and buckets of nails. The Japanese prisoners followed with hammers and gloves. The work was simple but demanding, each swing of the mallet echoing across the open land. One of the cowboys, an older man named Frank, his beard dusted gray, watched their awkward motions and stepped forward. "No, no," he said, tapping one man's shoulder gently. "You gotta pull the wire tight before you nail, like this." His hands moved slow, deliberate, the movements of someone who had done this all his life. The prisoner nodded, imitating the gesture, his brow furrowed in focus. Frank smiled, approving. "Good. You got it." It was a moment so small that most would have forgotten it instantly, but to the prisoners it meant something enormous. To be taught, not commanded, to be guided instead of corrected, was a gift they hadn't known how to receive. The morning passed in labor, the fence taking shape under the sun, and for the first time the men felt their work mattered not as punishment, but as contribution. Later, as they paused for water, one of the younger cowboys began mimicking the way a prisoner had tied his bandana around his head. The others laughed, and so did the Japanese man, surprised at himself. The sound startled them all, laughter without fear. Encouraged, another cowboy tried to teach them a phrase in Southern slang. "Ain't that something?" he said, slapping his knee. The prisoners repeated it clumsily. "Ain't that some thing?" and burst into laughter again when they mispronounced it. Soon they were trading words like stones across a stream. English, Japanese, gestures and grins filling in the gaps. It was communication without mastery, but it worked because it was rooted in goodwill. The workday stretched into evening, the sky painting itself in colors too vast to describe. As they loaded tools back onto the truck, Frank called out, "Hey, Kenji, grab that rope, will you?" The prisoner froze for a second, startled. No one had used his name since capture. To the guards, he had been a number, a category, an enemy. But now, hearing his name spoken plainly, without mockery or formality, something broke loose inside him. He turned slowly, met Frank's eyes, and nodded. "Yes," he said softly. The word felt strange in his mouth, humble yet full of power. That night, back in the barracks, the men spoke quietly about what had happened. "He called you Kenji," one said, "by name." Kenji nodded, still uncertain how to feel. "Perhaps," he murmured, "it means he does not see me as the enemy anymore." Another man whispered, "Or perhaps he never did." The thought settled over them like the evening wind, both comforting and painful. They had been stripped of everything, rank, homeland, pride, but in its place something unexpected had begun to grow. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. In the weeks that followed, the fences they built stood firm, the lines they once imagined between captor and captive began to blur. They shared tools, jokes, even stories told in broken half-words. The Cowboys learned to pronounce a few Japanese names, and the prisoners learned to whistle to signal break time. Trust didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, subtle as grass, reclaiming burned soil. Each small kindness, each shared moment of labor was a seed planted in the wreckage of war. And though none of them said it aloud, they all felt the same quiet truth taking root inside them. Peace doesn't come through surrender. It comes through recognition, the simple act of seeing another man as human. The nights that followed the wedding were thick with silence, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was a quieter kind, softened by something the prisoners did not yet have words for. When darkness fell over the camp, they lay on their bunks, staring at the rafters, each man listening for something only he could hear, the echo of fiddles, the hum of laughter, the clatter of boots against the barn floor. The music had ended weeks ago, yet it lingered like perfume on the wind, impossible to forget. Some swore they could still smell the smoke of barbecue drifting through the night air. Others said they could still hear the cowboy's voice, calm and certain. "Your guests today." For men who had spent years being told they were less than human, that small sentence had done what no sermon or speech could. It had cracked something deep inside them. The walls of hatred, built stone by stone through propaganda and pride, had begun to crumble. They found themselves talking quietly after lights out, not about war or surrender, but about home, the sound of the ocean, the smell of tatami mats, the faces of mothers they feared they'd never see again. The shame that once defined them began to loosen its grip. For the first time, they spoke their real names aloud, not numbers or ranks. It was a small rebellion, but a powerful one. The act of remembering who they were before the war had told them who to be. Days passed. The routine of work returned, fence mending, field plowing, the endless rhythm of labor, but the air between prisoners and cowboys was lighter now. A few Americans began greeting them in the mornings with nods or simple howdies. Some prisoners even tried answering back, the syllables awkward but sincere. Laughter became a sound that no longer felt dangerous. One afternoon, a cowboy accidentally dropped his hat, and a prisoner, without thinking, picked it up and brushed off the dust before handing it back. "Much obliged," the cowboy said. The phrase meant little to them linguistically, but the tone, grateful, unguarded, stayed with them all day. That night, as lantern light flickered through the barracks, the men spoke about what they had witnessed. One said quietly, "We were told Americans were beasts." Another replied, "Then why do beasts teach us to live like men?" The question hung in the air, heavy and luminous. Kindness, they realized, was not a trick. It was disarming in its simplicity, more powerful than force. It did not seek to conquer, it sought to remind. Each day, that reminder deepened. The men who had once marched in uniform now bent their backs in unison with their captors, planting wheat instead of flags. They learned to see the cowboys' laughter not as mockery, but as freedom, the sound of people who did not need hatred to know who they were. In that laughter, they glimpsed something sacred, a way of living beyond the shadow of ideology. The wedding became legend within the camp. Some called it a miracle, others an act of divine mercy. The story traveled between barracks like a whispered prayer. They spoke of it not to boast, but to believe, to remind themselves that the world could still choose gentleness even after tearing itself apart. And as they spoke, the bitterness that had once shaped them began to fade. If this story moved you, take a moment to let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's incredible to see how far these stories reach. And if you haven't yet, go ahead and like this video, then press the subscribe button right below and tap the notification bell beside it so you'll know when the next story premieres. Your support keeps these forgotten histories alive. By the time spring rolled across Texas, the fields outside the camp were alive with new grass, and the prisoners no longer felt the sting of their captivity. They could still see the fences, but they had stopped measuring the distance between themselves and freedom. It was no longer about escape. It was about return. Inside them, something had already crossed the line. They were no longer the soldiers who had arrived hollowed by obedience and shame. They were men again, changed not by victory, but by grace. And in the quiet hum of the night, beneath stars that belonged to no one nation, they understood what no bullet or flag could teach, that compassion is the only language that survives war. When the war finally ended and the transports came to take them home, the prisoners stood at the edge of the Texas fields in silence. The land they were leaving was bright with sunlight, the air warm and alive with the smell of grass and horses. They had arrived as captives and were departing as something far more complicated, men unmoored between two worlds. The cowboys who had watched over them tipped their hats as the trucks rumbled away. "Take care now," one called out. No one waved, but the words hung in the air, soft and heavy as dust. For weeks after, the Japanese men rode trains and ships across oceans, the memory of open skies and barbecue smoke clinging to them like the scent of another life. When they finally stepped onto Japanese soil, silence greeted them. What once had been home no longer felt alive. The docks were littered with wreckage. Across the horizon stretched a wasteland of ruins, cities flattened into ash, rivers choked with debris, people moving like ghosts among the rubble. The air reeked of smoke and sickness. The men who had eaten beef under Texan lanterns now stared at a homeland that looked starved of both food and hope. Their uniforms hung loosely on their bodies, but their faces were full, their eyes clear. For the starving crowds who watched them disembark, that health was an accusation. Some recognized no one. Mothers were gone, homes reduced to empty foundations. Others found families still alive but unrecognizing. Brothers who looked twice before embracing. Wives who whispered, "You've changed." And they had. Their bellies were rounder, their skin smoother, their voices steadier. They carried themselves with a strange calm that did not fit the landscape of ruin. One man, walking through what had been his neighborhood in Yokohama, stopped in front of the shell of his family's house. The smell of rot drifted through the wind. He thought of the wedding, of the laughter, of the small boy handing him a cookie. It felt like another lifetime, one too merciful to be real. At night, they dreamed of the barbecue fire. In the dream, they were surrounded by warmth, by abundance, by a kind of kindness their homeland had forgotten, and each morning when they awoke to hunger and ash, guilt pressed down like a stone. How could they speak of the food they had eaten while their families had boiled weeds for soup? How could they describe the cowboy's easy smile or the sound of fiddles while children in Tokyo dug through rubble for scraps? One prisoner, now home, whispered to a friend, "I feel I betrayed my country by surviving too well." Another replied, "No, we were betrayed long before we were captured." The guilt became their shadow. Many could not look at the starving faces around them without remembering the plates of meat, the cornbread melting with butter. They had tasted decency from their enemy, and now choked on shame among their own. Some tore up their letters from the camp, unwilling to share them. Others hid them carefully, hoping their children might one day read the truth when the world was less fragile. Those who did speak found themselves met with disbelief or anger. When one man told his neighbors, "The Americans treated us with respect," a veteran spat at his feet. "Lies! You say this to comfort your shame." Another accused him of being brainwashed by the enemy. The men stopped talking after that. Their truth was too gentle for a country still clinging to rage. But silence did not erase it. It lived inside them, unspoken but unbreakable, carried like a hidden ember in their hearts. And yet, even among ruins, small things endured. In a burned-out village, one former prisoner helped rebuild a bridge. When a hungry boy approached, he broke his bread in half and handed it over without a word. The act was instinctive, as natural as breathing. The boy blinked, startled by kindness. The man almost smiled. In that moment, he realized that what the cowboys had taught him had followed him home. Compassion, once offered, never truly dies. It lingers, passed from hand to hand, even in a broken land. The war had ended, but the truest battle continued, the struggle to remember without bitterness, to honor both survival and sorrow. And so, as the men rebuilt their homes among the ashes, they carried with them the faint music of a Texas wedding, the smoke of barbecue, and the voice of a cowboy saying, "Your guests today." It was a phrase that no ruin could erase. Years passed, and the world moved on. The men who had returned from Texas grew old in a Japan that rebuilt itself from ashes into glittering cities of glass and steel. The war became memory, then story, then silence. Yet, for one man, Kenji, the prisoner whose name had once been called across a dusty pasture, the memory of that single evening never faded. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he could still smell the smoke of hickory wood, still hear the creak of fiddles, still see the cowboy tipping his hat beneath the lanterns. He had been a broken soldier then, emptied of everything he believed about honor and hate. But that night in Texas had given him something back, a vision of decency so disarming it had remade the shape of his soul. When Kenji became a teacher, he carried the story with him. In classrooms filled with children too young to remember the war, he never spoke of battles or losses. He spoke instead of a wedding, of how, in the land of the enemy, men had shared food with their captives. His students listened, wide-eyed, when he told them about the cowboy who had said, "Your guests today." He explained that it was not just an invitation, but a kind of truce, a reminder that peace begins not with treaties or orders, but with human recognition. The children would laugh when he tried to describe the taste of Texas barbecue, the smell of the fire pit, the sound of boots on wood. But when he finished, the room always fell quiet. "The world," he would say, "was healed a little that day." As the years went on, other former prisoners began to tell the same story. It spread quietly among veterans' circles, first as rumor, then as remembrance. Men who had never met the Cowboys still spoke of them with reverence, calling that wedding a miracle. For them, it stood as proof that humanity had not been entirely lost in the war's cruelty. Even among American veterans who had once fought in the Pacific, the tale took on a kind of life. Some said it was impossible, an exaggeration. Others, who had worked in POW camps or heard whispers from the ranches, simply nodded and said, "It sounds like something a cowboy would do." For Kenji, the story was never about the food or the music. It was about the moment his enemy had chosen hospitality over vengeance. The invitation had broken through every layer of fear and indoctrination. "Your guests today." The words had sounded simple, almost casual, but their meaning was vast. They had declared peace before peace existed, respect before forgiveness was earned. In a world obsessed with victory, that act of humility had been the truest triumph of all. When Kenji visited Texas decades later, long after his hair had turned white, he stood at the edge of what had once been the camp. The fences were gone. The fields were wider than he remembered, the air still carrying that sweet smell of grass after rain. He found no trace of the barracks, no signs of captivity, only the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. He whispered the cowboy's words aloud, feeling them catch in his throat. "Your guests today." For a moment he closed his eyes and heard the faint echo of fiddles, the clatter of plates, the laughter of people who had chosen compassion over pride. He realized then what that night had truly meant. The invitation had not only freed them from hatred, it had freed him from the belief that cruelty was inevitable. It had shown him that dignity was not something granted by governments or conquered through war. It was a choice, made again and again, in the smallest gestures of grace. History would forget the names of those cowboys, the details of that wedding, even the faces of the men who stood beneath the lanterns. But their actions endured, rippling quietly through time. Kenji smiled faintly as he looked out over the land that had once been both his prison and his redemption. "The world," he whispered, "is healed by small things." And somewhere, in that endless sky, the music of that long-ago wedding seemed to rise once more, a song without words, carrying the truth he had spent a lifetime trying to teach, that sometimes the gentlest invitation can outlast an entire war,